In this video I'll be showing how to use the Agent SVN plugin to allow PowerBuilder 2017 to talk to Subversion for its source control management. So I'll assume that you've installed the Agent SVN plugin. The actual installation is fairly straightforward. It's just a matter of running the installer. And one of the things it'll do is it'll create this desktop icon. So the first thing we need to do is a one-off configuration for that plugin. So I'll just start up that configuration. It reports with a message saying you haven't configured it, and it also pops up the help. Now the actual configuration is quite easy, but you can read the help if you run into some trouble. At the top here we've got general behavior on how the plugin should work. For now we'll just leave it as it is. There's also no options for debugging, so if you do run into trouble you can turn on debugging, but when not in general use, just make sure the debug options are off because they do slow the plugin down. There are these status options, which basically the plugin will cache Subversion statuses, and I'll just point that out because that will refer to something inside PowerBuilder later on. So just these options here are ticked to the status options. Basically mean that Agent SVN will be caching the status. There's an option for an external difference tool, so you can plug in a difference tool if you like, and there's options on how the trunk prefix and postfix work. So just for the moment we'll leave them as it is. Now the bit that we do have to set up is the location of the Subversion repository itself. Now when I say location, it's actually the root location. It's not a location of a particular project, but it's the root location of all your projects. Now for this little example we're just going to create a local Subversion repository, so we're going to try and create a repository in this folder location. If I go back to there, all I need to do is tell it that's the folder. We're selecting the file protocol. In real life you'll be using one of the other HTTP or SVN protocols, but for this example we're just going to point it to the local file. It's just a good idea to do this anyway, just to get a feel for how things work. Now when I go apply, the plugin says I can't find a URL, I can't find a repository at that location, do you want me to create it? Now in the normal scheme of things you wouldn't see this message because you would have a repository at that location, but in this particular case we don't, so we'll let it create the repository. And if we go back to our Explorer window, now we have a Subversion repository that's been created. Okay, so now I've got a little test project for PowerBuilder. So if I now start up PowerBuilder, if I now open a workspace, there's our workspace. We can see this is just a stock standard example of a PowerBuilder workspace, and you can also see there's no indication that it's actually got any, it's not bound to source control. There's no extra icons there to say that it's bound. So how do we go about doing that? Well, if all we have to do is go to the workspace and go to the properties for that workspace, and in the source control panel we now go about defining the source control. So the first thing we need to do is tell it to use Agent SVN, and that entry will get added by the Agent SVN installer, so that should be there. If it isn't, you haven't installed the software. Next is the user ID. The user ID is if you've got access control on your Subversion source control, you need to make sure that that user ID matches the authentication that you have on the Subversion side, because it'll use that to authenticate. And next we need a project. Now this can be anything, but this will be the actual name of the project that gets created at the Subversion side. So to keep things sane, it would be a smart idea to keep them the same in sync. So in this case we've got my workspace, which matches the my workspace workspace that I have here. But as I said, this will be the project that gets created on the Subversion side of things. So in this particular case, it could also be called GenApp, for example. So this comes down to how you configure your naming conventions. And this is the status part that I was mentioning before. There's an option here for PowerBuilder to check file statuses. There's no need for that for it to do it, because Agent SVN will keep track of that anyway. So you don't want to be checking constantly for statuses, because it'll just be two things doing the same thing. So bump that up to a big number. The actual ticker lets you go higher, but the help file says it only goes to 59, so I'm not sure whether the bigger numbers work, but the higher the better. You could probably play around with that and see. And this is the first mistake that normally happens. If I now go and hit apply and go OK, it seems to give the indication that there's something has happened, because it's now got these indicators that say it's got source control bindings. But if you look at the actual message down here, it has actually failed. And the reason was because I failed to do one important thing. If I go back there, I failed to click on this button here. This is the button that actually will go away to the plugin and create this entry for me. So basically, because this is a brand new project, there is no sense of this project existing in source control, and that's what the error message down the bottom means. But when I go click over here, it's now gone away to Agent SVN, as you can see by the message box, and Agent SVN is saying, I can't find that item in that repository. Do you want me to add this? And of course, because this is a new instance, we go yes, and then we go apply. And this time, the bindings have actually worked, because now the project has been created on the Subversion side, and it has been bound to the Workspace. So to complete the actual, so at this stage, if we go back to our project, you can see I've got Tortoise SVN installed, and it's got indicators that it says parts of the system are now bound. So it's because it's created its Subversion working copy, but all these items here aren't in the source control yet, and that matches these plus signs here, because none of these items have been added to source control. So the next step in the process is to add all those items to source control. So we just right click on the workspace. I'll do that again, right click on the workspace, and at this point in time we can go add to source control. And so now it displays a list of things that we can add to source control. So we go OK, and this is all PowerBuilder doing this, and bang, 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 it works its way through the items, and now those plus signs turn into those little dots, indicating everything is now in source control. And we can also go back to source control, to the Explorer window, and sure enough, now all those items have been added to source control. And of course, we can look at the Tortoise SVN, go to the repo browser, and there you go. It's now added there. So that was the name that I gave for that initial dialog when Agent SVN said that item didn't exist. Do you wish me to create it? So that was the name that I entered into the properties of the workspace, and that's what I meant by you can name that whatever you like, because basically the way the system binds is the top part there is the base location, which is entered into the configuration dialog, and then these extra parts get appended depending on a project by project basis, and the trunk gets appended based on what type of prefix you want to use. But we can see it's now added all those items to the source control. And from there, we can now just start using the properties of the PowerBuilder to manage the file, the checkouts, the get latest, show differences. So for example, I'll check that out. It asks me, do I want to check it out? I go, okay. The dot turns into a tick. If I go back to my Subversion repo browser and do a refresh, it shows that I've now locked that out. Okay. Now again, that was one of those configuration items that you can change. You can add locking. If you don't like locking, you can take locking away. Now I can go in here, and I'm no PowerBuilder expert, but let's make some sort of simple change. And we can save that. And now when I check it in, I can give it a comment, my first change. If we go back to our refresh over here, you can see it's actually taken the lock off. And I can also go through the history there. If I show the history, it shows that I've actually made a change. I can show the differences for that change, and there's the differences that I made. So basically you can do all the stock standard things: check out, check in, and so on and so forth. So that's basically it in a nutshell. It's fairly easy to use. The hardest part, so as I said, what I would recommend is actually just playing around with it just to get a feel for how it works. You can actually access that configuration from here, I believe. I think it's from here. Run source control management. As I said, play around with it. Create a local working copy. Once you've actually got it, once you have a better handle on how it all works, then all you have to do is actually point it to your actual Subversion repository. And when you do the apply, make sure you don't get an error message, because if you get an error message, it means that the URL is wrong. And the URL is just shown there in this orgs path, so you can actually have an eye look at that, eyeball that. You can even use that same URL in Tortoise SVN to make sure, to double check that the actual final URL actually does connect to something that remotely resembles a Subversion version control. But that's basically it. That's how you can basically bind your workspaces to your Subversion repository using the Agent SVN plugin.